Welcome to Cheltenham, one of England's largest and most splendid spa towns. Home to a wide range of spectacular architecture, sprawling parks and more, on this walk we'll explore Cheltenham's history in depth, as we pass by local landmarks galore, including the beautiful Neptune's Fountain, the elegant Municipal Offices, the historic Cheltenham Ladies' College, the lively grounds of the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and the last remaining medieval building in this famously complete Regency-era town. All that's to come over the next half an hour, but we begin our walk in the area of town known as Montpellier, the central feature of Cheltenham's illustrious history as a spa town. Though busy with traffic on this evening, between the cars you'll find a variety of splendid landmarks that detail how Cheltenham spas developed, the most important being the building we can see just across the road, the Montpellier Spa. Nowadays home to an exclusive restaurant, the spa was built back in 1817 as the very first pump room in Cheltenham, which at the turn of the 19th century was fast growing in popularity as one of England's premier spa towns. But as we get going on our walk, let's just clarify what we mean when we talk about spa towns. Cheltenham, in similar fashion to other spa towns around the country like Harrogate, Leamington and Bath, is situated above natural springs, which produce water containing minerals that are said to contain great healing properties, either when drunk or when bathed in. These springs were discovered by locals in what was once the agricultural town of Cheltenham in the year 1716, and as word spread of the water's healing properties, more and more people, especially of the upper classes, came to this town to take the waters, giving birth to the famous spa industry, which saw Cheltenham's fortunes skyrocket over the following years. We'll explore more about the development of these spas as we continue our walk, but we've strayed off the main road into the sprawling Montpellier Gardens, opened in the early 19th century alongside the Montpellier Spa, as a place for those taking the waters to gather and stroll around. Nowadays, the gardens serve as a large town park, and in October of every year, the venue of Cheltenham's famous Literature Festival, which we can see is in full swing today. Held annually since 1949, the Cheltenham Literature Festival is the longest running literature festival in the world, and in its current guise it attracts writers, readers, publishers and more from all genres and all walks of life, with a wide range of events including interviews, readings and more, attracting over 100,000 visitors over the festival's 10 days. If you love literature and the written word in general, then Cheltenham's Literature Festival is billed as the only place to be each autumn, a place where you can mingle with like-minded bookworms and hear from authors, journalists and other public figures in the really delightful setting of the town's Montpellier Gardens. But while the open space of the gardens may just seem like a convenient place to host the festival, the two are actually much more closely linked, as the Literature Festival was just one part of a much wider effort by the town to continue drawing in visitors. The Literature Festival is one of the 4 Cheltenham festivals, the others being the Jazz, Science and Music festivals, held at different points throughout the year on a similar scale, and their origins can be traced back to 1945, when the first music festival was held here, in an era when traditional spa towns were declining in popularity. Relatively few people flocked to Cheltenham to take the waters as they once did, but the festivals have provided a new way for the town to continue attracting visitors throughout the year, and to make use of the splendid facilities that were built during the spa's heyday. Although, as you'll no doubt know, there is another, older and even more prestigious Cheltenham festival that takes place just outside the town at the Cheltenham Racecourse. We'll talk more about the iconic horse racing festival a little later on, but having made our way out of the Montpellier Gardens, we're once again looking at the Montpellier Spa, resplendent in white as we see it today. With its dome inspired by the Roman Pantheon and its impressive columns facing out onto the road, the building is a perfect example of how, during the heyday of the spas, splendidness and extravagance were a key consideration in the development of Cheltenham. In fact, this building was actually built as a replacement for an original pump room of 1809 that was made of wood, and it was by no means fit for the kind of clientele who were beginning to visit Montpellier. Over the years, the Montpellier Spa and its ballroom inside hosted everyone who was anyone in the 19th century, even visited by the Duke of Wellington on occasion. But just outside the building, there stands a splendid white marble statue of King Edward VII. Depicted here helping a poor girl, Edward wasn't famous for visiting Cheltenham spas, but this statue, erected after his death, doubled as a local fountain, pumping the town's famous waters up to street level for all passing by to take a drink. The statue, along with the variety of impressive and elegant buildings, are just some of the reasons that Montpellier has always been considered as the most majestic and most expensive part of Cheltenham. But where did the name for this part of the town come from? Well, for that, we have to look to a man named Henry Thompson, who was responsible for the initial development of Cheltenham's Montpellier in the early years of the 19th century. In 1801, Thompson bought a piece of land that was then known as Trafalgar Field, but upon discovering natural springs directly beneath the ground here, he began developing the field into Cheltenham's newest and most fashionable spa, one to rival even the most coveted in Europe. And at the time, the beautiful southern French city of Montpellier was widely known as a centre for health and learning, with an attractive face and a pleasant atmosphere, exactly the kind of place Henry Thompson sought to build. Nowadays, one of Cheltenham's most famously extravagant features are these, the 32 white Caryatid statues that stand between the shop fronts of Montpellier Walk. Sculpted in 1840, and based on models found in the Acropolis in Athens, Cheltenham's Caryatids were another example of how the town was inspired by Montpellier, as the statues were already widely used as a form of public decoration in 19th century France. These original items, having stood on Cheltenham streets for over 180 years now, speak volumes about how the town's illustrious heritage has been so beautifully preserved through time. In fact, in the 19th century, Montpellier here became so renowned as the creme de la creme of English spas that it, inspired by the French city, even went on to inspire the development of further Montpelliers around the country. To this day, you'll find a Montpellier Quarter in Harrogate, the Montpellier Villas in Brighton, and countless more Montpelliers in some of the most exclusive areas of Britain's towns and cities. But it was Cheltenham which was first to truly exemplify what people felt when they heard the name Montpellier. Of course, as we know, Cheltenham Springs were originally discovered just under a century before the development of Montpellier, and while the town initially benefited from those travelling to take the waters for health reasons, spa towns soon became increasingly fashionable, even for those who weren't in any particular need of healing. In the 19th century, spa towns were more of a place to socialise than to receive treatment, and as such, there needed to be much more to do in Cheltenham than simply bathe in or drink mineral water. Just around the corner here, we find the Montpellier Arcade, a covered shopping street that was built in 1832, and which was one of the very first purpose-built shopping arcades in Britain. An exquisite venue for ladies and gentlemen to stroll through and peruse shops selling all manner of exotic goods, the building of the Montpellier Arcade, along with the rotunda and more, demonstrated how Cheltenham spas were becoming less about health and much more about leisure. In fact, Cheltenham became known as the effective party capital of Regency-era England. Its shopping facilities, hotels, ballrooms and more meant that upper-class visitors could relax and party to their heart's content in town, while in 1815, horse racing began for the first time in Cheltenham, and began attracting people too. Initially held on a small scale, it wasn't until 1904 that the Cheltenham Festival was born, as the already prestigious Grand National Hunt Meeting was moved to be held at the newly built Cheltenham Racecourse from its previous venue at Warwick Racecourse. Cheltenham and Warwick initially shared hosting duties in the early 20th century, but by 1911, Cheltenham Racecourse became the sole venue, and the event has grown into one of the most prestigious in Britain today. As we pass by the United Reformed Church of St Andrews, built in 1886, The Cheltenham Festival that exists today is famed for its legendary atmosphere, snazzy dress code, and programme of action-packed races, including the Cheltenham Gold Cup, which is second only to the Grand National in prestige and prize money on the British horse racing calendar. The Cheltenham Festival, which many people visit simply to party rather than to watch the horses, is fully in keeping with this town's spectacularly lively heritage. But just up ahead, we're looking at an imposing landmark that was built for anything but partying. This is the main building of the prestigious Cheltenham Ladies' College, founded back in 1853 as the place to provide a sound academic education for girls. Having been initially located elsewhere in Cheltenham, with just 82 girls enrolled, the college moved here to the heart of town in 1873, which sparked an important change for the school. Led by Principal Dorothy Beale, a driven educator of women, the college was transformed from providing girls with the traditionally female education to offering subjects like maths, science and more, which was pushed through despite opposition even from parents, who felt that these kind of classes were not suitable for girls. Expanding over the years to its current size, which takes up an entire block of the town centre, Cheltenham Ladies' College has grown impressively to become one of England's most prestigious and highly ranked girls' schools. The school is today a nationally recognised symbol of Cheltenham, and it's an institution which proudly celebrates the town too. One example being the school crest, which rather interestingly features 2 pigeons in its upper third. Pigeons, as strange as it may seem, are actually credited with having brought Cheltenham to the point it is today, as, according to legend, it was only because locals saw pigeons pecking at salt deposits in the ground that they discovered the local mineral springs. Springs which of course saw Cheltenham's fortunes rise dramatically as the spa industry took off. For their work of discovery, the pigeons have been returned in kind with a starring role on the town's coat of arms. But having strolled through the most famous area of Cheltenham spas, we've actually now made our way out of Montpellier to find ourselves on the main street through town, known as the Promenade. The Promenade stretches all the way from Montpellier towards the oldest part of Cheltenham, which we'll be visiting later on in our walk. But here, the street is dominated by the beautiful Queen's Hotel, which was built in 1837. That was the year, as you may know, that Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, and this hotel was named and built as a celebration of the new Queen, while also serving as an important new venue for visitors to Cheltenham. It's said that the hotel was originally going to be named the Royal Victoria, but the Queen's Hotel was one of the largest built in Cheltenham for its time, taking the pressure off the smaller, locally run inns and taverns, which had become fast overwhelmed by the influx of visitors to the town, which included many famous names over the years. Fronted by an ornate, gold-tipped Crimean War Memorial, the hotel was visited by none other than Charles Dickens, Edward Elgar, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, just to name a few, while it stands on the site of the original Sherborne Spa, one of Cheltenham's oldest, and which helped to transform the town into its current guise. The Sherborne Spa was opened in 1818, a time when Cheltenham, despite being an increasingly popular spa town, was still a little rough around the edges. The Promenade was a soggy, marshy dirt track that ran straight through the middle of town, while the surroundings of the spa buildings were no place to explore and stroll around during visitors' downtime. However, in the same year as the Sherborne was opened where the Queen's Hotel stands today, the Promenade was transformed into a gorgeous tree-lined avenue, and these exquisite gardens, known as the Imperial Gardens, were opened for the first time. Originally laid out as the pleasure grounds exclusively for the Sherborne Spa, which later changed its name to the Imperial Spa, the Imperial Gardens here were adapted into their current appearance just after the Second World War, with beautiful flower beds dotted around the landscape of the old pleasure grounds. You can still clearly see the layout of the original Regency-era gardens, however, which makes a stroll around this modern park like taking a walk through a period drama, while the original Regency-era fountain still exists today. Now it's home to a statue of one Gustav Holst, the famed composer who was born in Cheltenham back in 1874. This statue, which was erected in 2008, is dedicated to the locally born composer, who began his career as a choir boy at the local All Saints Church, where his father, originally from Latvia, played the organ. Holst, born into a family of musicians, went on to become an acclaimed composer himself, rocketing to fame just after the First World War with his orchestral suite, The Planets, an iconic work that's still performed to this day, has appeared in countless films and TV shows, and was even instrumental in inspiring composer John Williams' instantly recognisable Imperial March and Force theme in the Star Wars movies. As well as serving as home to the Holst statue, the Imperial Gardens are also a regular venue for music in Cheltenham. In the summer, the Gardens host the town's science and jazz festivals, while they back onto the exquisite Town Hall, a grand venue regularly used for concerts that we'll now go and take a look at. Now back out onto the promenade, lined with trees and beautiful Georgian-era housing that replaced the once ramshackle nature of the town centre, Cheltenham is a town that's always buzzing with life, home to just over 100,000 people today. And Gustav Holst isn't the only famous figure to come out of this delightful Gloucestershire town. There's a wealth of notable Cheltonians who've called this place home, from Eddie the Eagle Edwards, the famous amateur ski jumper who was born here in 1963, to footballer Geoff Hurst, the first man to score a hat-trick in a World Cup final, and who moved to Cheltenham later in life. Back in the sphere of music, meanwhile, Cheltenham is also the hometown of Brian Jones, the founding member of the Rolling Stones, and who led the band in their initial rise to prominence in the early 1960s. Under Jones, the Rolling Stones started out as more of a bluesy outfit, although as the decade progressed, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger developed the group into its more famous hard rock persona, while Jones sadly struggled with drug and alcohol problems, and was dismissed from the Stones in 1969, just under a month before his death at the age of 27. Having now wandered just around the corner from the Imperial Gardens, we find ourselves in front of Cheltenham Town Hall, the town centre's grandest venue, which was opened in 1903. Designed as Cheltenham's premier events venue, the Grand Town Hall replaced the former assembly rooms that stood on the High Street in the oldest part of town. Built at the turn of the 20th century, this was part of those wider efforts to revive Cheltenham's fortunes as spa towns were gradually falling in popularity. And in 1906, a brand new central spa, serving 4 different kinds of medicinal waters, was added to the town hall. Unfortunately, the decline of Cheltenham's spas couldn't be stemmed, but as an entertainment venue, the town hall took off, in 1943 famously hosting performances from a young amateur comic by the name of Norman Wisdom, whose appearances here in Cheltenham were so good that one day actor Rex Harrison, who was in the audience, came backstage and convinced Wisdom to turn professional. That's just one of the many stories of Cheltenham's Town Hall, but as we now return to the busy promenade, we mustn't forget to mention the story of the wealth of beautiful Regency architecture to be found in town. Cheltenham is regarded as one of the most complete Regency-era towns in England, with the vast majority of architecture from the period still intact. Most of the buildings we see around us date from between 1820 and 1840, a period when Cheltenham's population nearly tripled in size, growing from just over 13,000 to more than 36,000, as the spa's popularity reached its peak. Exquisite houses were built all over the town centre and in new estates on the outskirts of town, but it's here on the promenade that you'll find the most beautiful features of all. In front of us just here is the truly splendid Neptune's Fountain, unveiled in 1893 and surely one of the most gorgeous spots in all of Cheltenham. Said to have been modelled on the iconic Trevi Fountain in Rome, Neptune's Fountain here was actually commissioned by the town to rejuvenate the promenade in the late 19th century, and as well as featuring some truly beautiful craftsmanship in its design, the water that jumps from its spouts is also especially interesting. The fountain's supply comes not from the mineral springs beneath the ground, but rather from the River Chelt, the small river which takes its name from the town of Cheltenham, and which is flowing directly beneath our feet, through a large culvert that takes it beneath the road, and which links it to Neptune's Fountain. The Chelt, just 14 miles in length, is far from a major river, but it is one of the many tributaries that flows into the River Severn, the longest river in Great Britain. And it was also a key reason for the initial settlement of Cheltenham, centuries and centuries before the springs were discovered deep beneath the ground. In fact, Cheltenham's history can be traced all the way back to the 9th century AD, when it was of course much smaller, and principally located a few hundred yards to the north of where we are now. We'll venture towards that area of town in a few minutes' time, but we're now looking towards the spectacular Municipal Offices, one of the finest features of Cheltenham's Promenade, and which are fronted by the exquisite Long Gardens. The Long Gardens, once used as private gardens, are today the site of a number of Cheltenham's main monuments, including this statue of the Cheltonian Edward Wilson. Born here in 1872, Wilson was a renowned explorer of the Antarctic in the early 20th century, serving as a leading member of the pioneering Discovery expedition to the Antarctic in the 1900s. He was also one of 5 men who sought to become the first to reach the South Pole on what became the infamous Terra Nova expedition of 1911 to 1913, where Wilson and his 4 colleagues did reach the pole, but were beaten by a team of Norwegians led by Roald Amundsen, who got there just 34 days before. Even more tragically, the 5 members of the British Terra Nova expedition perished on the return journey from the South Pole, but Wilson is still remembered here in his hometown of Cheltenham. Wilson isn't the only Cheltonian who lost his life to be commemorated in the Long Gardens, however. Here we find ourselves looking up at Cheltenham's War Memorial, a grand obelisk unveiled here in 1921, and which bears the names of 1,289 local men who lost their lives fighting in the conflicts of the 20th century, from the First World War all the way up to the Falklands War. The memorial dedicated to them rightly occupies a prominent position right in the heart of modern Cheltenham, standing out in front of the Municipal Offices, perhaps the town's most beautiful buildings of all. Stretching for just over 600 feet alongside Cheltenham's Promenade, the Municipal Offices date back to 1835, when they were originally built as a row of private houses. Originally, these houses were known as Harwood's buildings, after Samuel Harwood, who developed the town's promenade and the old Sherborne Spa. But in 1915, the terrace's 5 central houses were converted into offices, granting it the new name, the Municipal Offices. By 1958, 13 of the Municipal Office's 19 houses had been converted for use by businesses, while the complex remains the home of the Cheltenham Borough Council, making it the central administrative building in the town. It's impossible not to stop and admire the majesty of the Municipal Offices when taking a walk down Cheltenham's Promenade, and it's a good thing that they're still standing after nearly 200 years. As we've mentioned, Cheltenham is regarded as one of the most complete Regency-era towns in England, and while many buildings are now listed and preserved for posterity, the town did fall victim to a surprising attack from above in the Second World War. Cheltenham wasn't a town which played a major role in the war, but despite this, in December of 1940, 20 people were killed when a bomb was dropped by the Luftwaffe on Cheltenham, in the area close to where the train station is today, an attack that also left more than 600 locals homeless and a number of houses destroyed. This was likely caused by a bomb dropped by German planes making their way back from raids on Coventry further north, and the damage was significant, though many of the town centre's most historic buildings were fortunately spared. Also spared was this, the town's Boer War Memorial, which was unveiled in 1907 in memory of the local men who died in the Second Boer War, and which today also bookends the Municipal Offices and the beautiful Long Gardens. But having taken a look at this most gorgeous of examples of Regency architecture in Cheltenham, we're now going to press on further along the promenade, into an area of town where the landmarks are arguably not quite as exquisite, but are certainly no less historic. Here, the promenade changes from a busy road into a pedestrianised shopping street, most of the shops being converted Georgian houses with shop fronts that were added in the mid-20th century. Now we know that the promenade was developed in the 19th century with the addition of its beautiful rows of trees, which actually also feature on Cheltenham's coat of arms, and it became the perfect place for those visiting the town to stroll up and down, and to explore the items on sale in Cheltenham's shops. That's still the case today, with this pedestrianised section at the promenade's northern end flanked by yet more great trees and shops on both sides, including Cavendish House just to our right, Cheltenham's oldest and best-loved department store, dating back to 1823. And just outside the entrance to Cavendish House, you'll find this interesting sculpture, known as the Hare and the Minotaur. Sculpted in 1995 by local artist Sophie Ryder, the Hare and the Minotaur was one of a number of sculptures that appeared at an exhibition at the Cheltenham Art Gallery that year, and it proved so popular with the public that it was decided one of her sculptures should remain in town for good, the Hare and the Minotaur being chosen as the one to be displayed on the promenade for years to come. Now, despite its historic reputation as a luxurious shopping street, Cheltenham's promenade has a rather humble history from before the days of the spas. Historically, this was merely a long dirt track that stretched out of Cheltenham's historic centre, roughly in the direction of Gloucester and Bristol. But it was around this track that most of the town's natural springs were discovered, leading to its development. But what was Cheltenham like before the spas changed its fortunes forever? Well, as we near the end of the promenade, we're now walking into the oldest part of Cheltenham, a place that's been settled for around 1200 years, and which existed for much of its life as a collection of houses around one single, fairly unremarkable road. That road is what is today Cheltenham's High Street, which we'll take a walk along in a few minutes' time. But having now walked off the promenade, we're looking towards the curving facades of Clarence Street, home to the popular Bank House pub, which takes its name from the fact that the beautiful white Regency era building it's housed in used to be the home of the Cheltenham and Gloucestershire Bank from the 1830s to the 1850s. But long before any of these buildings even existed, it was not too far away from the spot that Cheltenham's very first mineral springs were discovered all the way back in 1716. It was in a field somewhere between here and where Cheltenham Ladies' College now stands that local farmer William Mason noticed the pigeons pecking at the ground on his land. To his eyes, these pigeons looked especially healthy, and upon digging down into the ground and finding rejuvenating mineral water with fantastic healing properties, Mason promptly fenced off the spring and began charging others to take a drink. This was of course the earliest origin of Cheltenham's spas, but before the springs were discovered, this was a predominantly agricultural settlement, with farms spreading out all around the area where we are now, and roughly 2,000 people living on and around the High Street. Owing to the feverish development of the spa town in the 19th century, however, next to nothing remains of that era, except for the building that we find nestled in a quiet corner of the town centre, the historic St Mary's Church. St Mary's, Cheltenham's historic parish church, is the only building from the medieval era that remains standing in Cheltenham, and while the town has grown up around it, the church has barely changed for the best part of 800 years. The oldest parts of St Mary's are more than 850 years old, dating to the mid-12th century, while its impressive tower is slightly newer, dating to the 13th century. Given the way that Cheltenham has changed so dramatically over the last couple of hundred years, it's remarkable that this church is still standing, but the building holds an important and now irreplaceable key to the town's pre-spa history. Such is the significance of St Mary's, in 2013 the church was given the honorific title of Cheltenham Minster by the Bishop of Gloucester, a title reserved for churches of special importance. But despite its age, this church wasn't even the first to exist on this spot. In fact, St Mary's is thought to stand on a site that's been used by Cheltonians for religious worship for more than 1200 years, an Anglo-Saxon chapel that stood here having been one of the very first permanent structures built in Cheltenham. Cheltenham, or as it was known then, Cheltenham, was first recorded as a settlement in the year 803 AD, but it remained a fairly rudimentary village for a few centuries until the year 1223, when Cheltenham was granted the rights to hold markets by King Henry III. This was a major step in the town's history, because as a venue for markets, people from around the region would come to Cheltenham to buy and sell goods of all sorts, and in many cases bring their trades and settle here for good, At the time Cheltenham's market was established, the settlement consisted exclusively of this road, which started from around here by the church. Nowadays, this road is of course Cheltenham's High Street, just one of the many busy roads to be found around town. But it's here where you'll find the bulk of Cheltenham's pre-spa heritage. Here, we're looking towards the rather sleek new Brewery Quarter shopping centre, a mall which takes its name from the fact that it stands on the site of the historic Cheltenham Brewery, which provided a large part of income for the medieval town alongside agriculture. The history of brewing and malting in Cheltenham can be traced back centuries to a time when it took place inside people's homes. But the first official Cheltenham brewery was established right here in the year 1760, and it continued to produce locally brewed ales all the way until 1998. Some of the old brewery buildings have been incorporated into the shopping centre that took its place in the 2000s. But it wasn't the only industry that took place on Cheltenham's historic High Street here. Now the High Street, which as the only street in town once led locals to refer to Cheltenham as a whole as Cheltenham Street, actually stretched northwest from the church, the opposite direction to where we're walking now. But it was around the end of the street here that you would have found a variety of shops and stalls selling all sorts of goods, meat in particular, and the wealth of butchers' shops here. Farms also spread out from directly behind the houses of the High Street into the areas of Cheltenham where the likes of the Promenade, Montpellier and the Pittville Estate exist today. But as a town almost entirely focused around one busy street filled to the brim with markets, Cheltenham wasn't exactly the most attractive place in the region, even in the first years of its popularity as word of its springs began to spread. So while we know of the importance of the natural springs, what was the spark that lit Cheltenham's transition from simple market town to splendid spa town? Well, William Mason, the farmer who discovered the spring, later saw his land pass into the hands of a retired sea captain by the name of Henry Skillicorn, who was ahead of his time when it came to attracting visitors to Cheltenham Springs. In the early 1740s, Skillicorn built assembly rooms beside the waterwell, which gave people a place to relax, socialise and even dance, while he even created his own elegant tree-lined avenue that took people towards the spring. It was during that period that Cheltenham was visited by more and more people, one of whom was a physician that went by the name of Dr. Short, and who later published a book titled The History of Mineral Waters, in which he declared Cheltenham's some of the best in Britain. This was a huge boost to the town's burgeoning spa industry, but it was in 1788 that Cheltenham really hit the big time, when none other than King George III visited the town for a 5-week treatment. During that time, the King sampled Cheltenham's now famous waters, hoping that their healing properties would cure a recent decline in his health. It appears that the treatment was a modest success, as George also had time to sample Cheltenham's smattering of entertainment venues as well as the surrounding scenery. And so it was this royal visit which truly cemented Cheltenham as one of the nation's premier spa destinations, followed by decades of constant growth and development. We know the story of how Cheltenham spas went from strength to strength throughout the 19th century, and although they eventually declined in popularity when the 20th century rolled around, the town has, as you can see, managed to keep itself ticking along very nicely. The iconic Regency architecture is mirrored in more recent developments elsewhere in town, and with plenty of shops, restaurants and many more things to do, Cheltenham has even been named in recent years as one of the best places to live in England's southwest, with a number of especially affluent suburbs surrounding the town centre. It's certainly a lovely place to visit, and there's a fascinating story behind the beautiful gardens, buildings and streets that make up this sprawling modern town, from its early origins in the Anglo-Saxon era, through its time as a medieval market town, to its Regency heyday as a luxurious spa town and party capital. There's plenty more to see and learn about in Cheltenham than we've explored on this walk, but with the sun setting over the town on this lovely evening, it's here on the High Street, where it all began, that we'll be ending our tour of Cheltenham for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you're looking forward to visiting splendid Cheltenham for yourself sometime soon.